Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Danube Institute. We're very fortunate in having a lecture by a prominent Australian political leader, and on a topical question generated by Australia, namely the recent voice referendum, but an event of importance, of worldwide importance, because it was an example of identity politics, and identity politics are increasingly a major factor in world politics, particularly in the Anglosphere, but increasingly too in Europe, Central and Western, and other parts of the world. In fact, my general view would be that the woke revolution, identity politics and its allied topics are going to be a question, and I think a problem, in almost every country. Our speaker is well equipped to discuss this question. He is Tony Abbott, the former Prime Minister of Australia, and somebody who has had a long experience in politics, but also in international affairs. He is a former journalist, which I, as a journalist, think is a good sign, because it shows that he has been compelled by deadlines to deal with a whole range of topics which he might otherwise have been happy to neglect. And secondly, it's as a job which persuades its possessor, its occupant, to actually explain things clearly in a way that readers will both want to continue reading and will get the point. I think the more journalists go into politics, the clearer we will know what mistakes they are making, and the better we will be off, because we can correct them. Now, Mr. Abbott was very far-sighted as a politician in seeing, where a lot of other politicians didn't, the real import, the real meaning of certain policies that came forward. He was, I would say, something like 10 to 12 years ahead of the entire world conservative movement in seeing that conservatives had neglected, in their obsession with getting the GDP increased, conservatives had neglected some of the social problems that had piled up. In particular, the problem that we are neglecting the parents in society, parents who do two important things for nations. They have the next generation, they bring them into the world, and secondly, they educate that generation and they train them in every conceivable way, so that we live in a better society as a result of having good parents. And if we allow the family to decay and we allow parenthood to be without honor, we will find in a generation or so that we have made terrible mistakes, which will become evident in crime figures, divorce statistics, and increasingly, it seems, mental health problems. So I want to, in particular, cite that insight, because it is something which the conservatives worldwide and governments worldwide are beginning to realize the importance of. Now, the topic of the voice referendum, I will leave the speaker to outline, but I will say, when we get to discussing it after his remarks, we will see in our politics and in the politics of countries as different as the United States and Chile, that the international left is increasingly looking for ways of getting round the voters, increasingly looking for ways of ensuring that their policies are adopted, even if they fail the test of both either elections or referenda. And that is something which we really have to be aware of if we are to place some restraint on radical progressive policies, which are increasingly presented to us. So, Mr. Abbott, The topic is a hot one and an increasingly important one, and the floor is yours.
Well, John, thank you very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for making me welcome. It's wonderful to be here at the Danube Institute yet again, and this is a place where I think ideas come to be thoroughly thrashed out, and nearly everyone goes away not just better informed, but hopefully somewhat wiser. Australia has grabbed the world's attention a bit lately. During the pandemic, we grabbed the world's attention, I think, for the wrong reasons, by locking ourselves up more than any country other than China for a period. Australia, which had begun its modern life as a penal colony, once more became prison island. Just at the moment, I think we're on the verge of drawing the world's attention to ourselves as our Prime Minister does battle with Elon Musk over the extent to which bureaucrats should regulate free speech online. But in the voice referendum, I think we actually drew the world's attention to ourselves for good reasons rather than bad. So, just 6 months on, it's clear that the voice vote in Australia was both encouraging and discouraging. Encouraging in that it was the first time anywhere in the world that an issue of identity politics was put to the people and resoundingly defeated, but discouraging in that the political class and the elite establishment seemed determined to push on with indigenous separatism, as if the vote had never happened or didn't really mean anything. Last October, the Australian people voted against a change to the Constitution that would have created a constitutionally entrenched, ancestry-based voice able to make representations to the Parliament and to the executive government on matters relating to Indigenous people, who are currently just under 4% of the population of Australia. In defeating this, Australians voted in keeping with Martin Luther King's immortal plea that his children not be judged by the colour of their skin, but by the content of their character, which in turn reflected St. Paul's noble declaration that there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for all are one in Christ Jesus. Now, should this change have proceeded, anything government planned that potentially impacted on Indigenous people, from tax to social security to infrastructure to the placement of defence bases, could have enabled a representation from the voice, plus a response to it from government before it could go ahead. And given the lack of specificity in the proposed change, what constituted adequate consideration of any representation and what constituted an adequate response to it would have been decided in the courts, in another example of the growing global democratic deficit. Originally dubbed a third chamber of the Parliament and subsequently a fourth arm of government in addition to the executive, legislative and judicial arms, the voice was a very substantial change to the way government would work. It would have created two classes of citizen based on ancestry, made the processes of government even more gummed up, and reinforced the separatism that's at the heart of Indigenous disadvantage. Professor Megan Davis, a voice architect, described it as a, quote, change to the structure of Australia's public institutions that would, quote, redistribute public power, creating, she said, quote, an institutional relationship between government and First Nations that will compel the state to listen to them in policy and decision-making. Naturally, that wasn't how its proponents presented it to voters. The cartoonist, Johannes Leek, satirised the Prime Minister's case for the voice with a pastiche of his own words. It's an outstretched hand, an invitation to walk together. It's an olive branch, a gracious offer. It's a wave of hope, a brighter dawn, a better tomorrow. It's modest, it's transformative. It's a movement, it's a vibe, it's having a crack. But deep down, the Voice proponents were guilting Australians about what they called invasion and dispossession rather than largely peaceful settlement, in the same way that cultural Marxists guilt America over slavery and Britain over empire. And it's true that Indigenous people overall have considerably worse educational, employment, incarceration, health and housing outcomes than other Australians, as Indigenous people do in most countries. But the really severe disadvantage is in outback Australia, not in the cities and towns where about 3/4 of Aboriginal people live and are reasonably well integrated into the general community. It's where Indigenous people still live in what are usually former mission stations, often hundreds of kilometres away from any major town, once subsistence but now welfare-dependent settlements where kids often don't go to school, adults mostly don't go to work, and the ordinary law of the land is sometimes only sporadically and often selectively policed. That's where life is all too often nasty, poor, brutal and short. Naturally, most Australians are worried and somewhat embarrassed about this, but Voice proponents could never explain how another bureaucracy on top of all the existing ones would improve things. They said that nothing else had worked, but the Voice seemed more like doubling down on failure than a fresh start, especially as its proponents were the same people who'd been advising governments for years. Given that society changes person by person, and institutional change really only works if it fosters this, improving lives in remote Australia is more the work of generations than a constitutional quick fix, in which youngsters henceforth get a good primary education on country, a good secondary education in a normal boarding school at a major centre, to return to their communities as tradies or professionals, or on holiday or in retirement, having individually been empowered to make real choices about the lives they lead and the places they live, which is easy to conceptualise but hard to deliver, given the practical difficulties of getting demotivated families to send their kids to school, getting good teachers to stay in remote places, and getting flighty teenagers to persevere in challenging tasks in unfamiliar towns, especially with an activist class pushing a message of grievance, victimhood and entitlement. It was this activist class that crafted the 2017 Uluru Statement calling for Voice Treaty Truth, a constitutionally entrenched voice, treaties between different levels of government and specific Indigenous tribes and clans, and so-called truth-telling, with Australia's history presented largely as a story of dispossession and frontier violence. The one-page version, the Uluru Statement, cloaked what was a demand for power and reparations in uplifting language, but the full 26-page version was pretty clear that this was an Indigenous bid to gain the privileged place akin to a local House of Lords that the activists thought the descendants of the original inhabitants should always have had. The Uluru Statement was the culmination of a process that was originally meant to lead to no more than the simple recognition of First Australians in the Constitution. That in turn had begun back in 2007, when then Prime Minister John Howard had committed the Liberal National Coalition to constitutional recognition instead of supporting an apology for the past mistreatment of Aboriginal people. Howard's reasoning was sound, because an apology from people who have done no wrong themselves to people who have not been wronged themselves is just empty virtue signalling. But what Howard had intended as a straightforward acknowledgement that Aboriginal people were here first and had an ongoing honoured place in our country, and what I had envisaged when PM might be a statement in the preamble of the Constitution that modern Australia had, quote, an Indigenous heritage, a British foundation and an immigrant character, became a Trojan horse for radical constitutional change. Anthony Albanese's first words as Prime Minister after winning the 2022 election were to commit to implementing the Uluru Statement in full. When he launched the specific voice proposal at the subsequent Gama Festival, there was about 70% opinion poll support for what the PM pitched as little more than an act of courtesy to Aboriginal people. Even though it was soon apparent that some very significant Indigenous leaders, such as Senator Jacinta Price, who'd formerly been the Deputy Mayor of Alice Springs, and Warren Mundine, a business leader who'd formerly been the National President of the Labor Party before switching party, thought that the voice would divide our country by race without ending Aboriginal disadvantage or reflecting traditional Indigenous governance by local elders. Price and Mundine's role in the campaign was crucial because having Aboriginal people against the voice gave everyone permission to be against it without fearing that they might be closet racists. In late 2022, Price succeeded in persuading the junior coalition partner, the National Party, to take a formal position opposing the voice. Meanwhile, the PM was demanding that the senior coalition partner, the Liberal Party, offer bipartisan support, but without offering to change his proposal or even to confine it to a voice to Parliament only, as suggested by his Attorney-General, and refusing to answer Opposition Leader Peter Dutton's request to provide more detail. Then in April last year, after previously being open to some form of local and regional voices, Dutton made the big call to oppose the national voice, despite poll support still being 50% plus and over the objections of the relevant shadow minister who subsequently resigned. Yet when the vote was finally taken on October 14 last year, it was resoundingly defeated, 61% to 39%, with all states and territories opposed except the government-dominated Australian Capital Territory, and with 3/4 of Labor-held electorates recording a majority against it, even though there had been no obvious dissension from senior Labor figures. Like the 2022 defeat of constitutional change in Chile to enshrine Indigenous rights and environmental alarmism, and the even more recent defeat of constitutional change in Ireland to remove allegedly archaic references to women and motherhood, the Australian people, who'd earlier voted 60-40 for marriage equality, voted 60-40 against racial inequality and in favour of the equal citizenship of all. It showed how a relatively unpopular opposition leader who was prepared to take a stand and argue his case could help to make mission impossible out of something that was previously almost inevitable and turn himself into a credible alternative Prime Minister in the process. Remarkably, the voice went down despite overwhelming backing from big business, big tech, big sport and big philanthropy. The Ramsay Foundation's $7 million donation to the Yes campaign was the biggest single arm's-length political gift in Australian history. More than half a dozen major public companies gave over $1 million each. Subsequently released Electoral Commission figures showed that the $60 million spent by the Yes campaign was 4 times the spending of Voice opponents. It was a David and Goliath struggle that showed a strong majority of individual Australians were largely impervious to celebrity appeals and being pushed around by the morally superior. It was a seismic instance of quiet Australians' revolt against their elites. Yet other than a glum acknowledgement that the result had to be accepted, there's been almost no change in government policy or elite positions. The federal government has not rescinded the $6 million earlier committed to advancing the truth-telling element in the Uluru Statement. It still supports state governments' moves towards treaty negotiations. In both Victoria and Queensland, there are ongoing moves to create formal instruments giving local Indigenous groups substantial control over the management of national parks and Crown lands, and even special access to royalties. Iconic landmarks like Uluru itself, Mount Warning in New South Wales and part of the Grampians in Victoria remain off limits to non-Indigenous climbers. Most domestic flights still land to an acknowledgement of country. Nearly all civic gatherings still begin with paying respects to local Indigenous elders, past and present, as if the country only belongs to some of us, not all of us, despite Marshal Langton declaring that these welcomes would cease if the referendum failed. The flag of some of us still flies co-equally with the flag of all of us, including on Sydney Harbour Bridge, thanks to a Liberal Premier who'd earlier said that this was just Labor's latest social justice warrior cause, notwithstanding Labor's greatest PM, Bob Hawke, his immortal declaration on our bicentenary day that Australia had, quote, no hierarchy of descent and, quote, no privilege of origin. So, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that most people in authority, whether in government, business or institutions, on this issue at least, regard the majority of the public as a basket of deplorables to be circumvented if possible and otherwise ignored. It's just the latest example of an administrative state or expertocracy getting on with its objectives regardless of the people, an antipodean version of the Swamp's refusal to accept the legitimacy of Trump's 2016 win and the Ramona British establishment's ongoing sabotage of Brexit. In response to sustained hostile questioning about the impact of colonialism, the heroic Jacinta Price told Australia's National Press Club, I guess that would mean those of us whose ancestors were dispossessed of their own country and brought as convicts in chains are also suffering from intergenerational trauma. So I should be doubly suffering from intergenerational trauma. This was a magnificent riposte to those who wanted the alleged sins of some of their ancestors committed against others of their ancestors to found compensation claims many decades or even centuries later. Why, indeed, should people who have themselves done no wrong be required to feel guilty about the circumstances of people who've had no wrong done to them, simply because some are identified as white and others black? It's another example of the Marxist division of the world into oppressors and oppressed, regardless of the circumstances of people's real lives. Still, the fact that little has changed post-referendum shows the pervasiveness of this thinking and how acquiescent in it officialdom at every level has become. Dealing with this is going to be much harder than dealing with the referendum itself. It will mean revisiting the self-determination policy that's been in place since Gough Whitlam's time, that's never really been subject to widespread public debate, let alone a vote, giving Aboriginal people structures of their own, beyond and often outside those of other Australians. Aboriginal health services, Aboriginal legal services, and Aboriginal corporations, often operating like parallel local government bodies. People should be treated, says Price, on an individual and not on a racial basis. She's right, of course, but no one should underestimate the challenge inherent in rolling back the creeping separatism of 5 decades. The lessons are that ordinary voters are less gullible than the academics, who think that you can end racism via even more racism, only well-intentioned this time. That even an unpopular leader can win a vote with a superior argument and a better principle. That major change needs more than the vibe in its favour to succeed. And that starting miles behind doesn't mean success is impossible. Still, Indigenous separatism is one of the products of the left's long march through the institutions that will take a long countermarch to rectify. Yet a strong start has been made. I should conclude, John, by doing my best to answer the question that you really posed from the podium at the beginning. What is necessary to ensure that the insidious denial of democracy by so many people in positions of behind-the-scenes power is countered? When I was a minister, I had a practice of never allowing the public service to begin a meeting, because if I allowed the public servants to begin the meeting by telling me what they thought and telling me what they wanted, in the end I was running on their agenda, not mine. As a Prime Minister, I tried to stress to all of my colleagues that they weren't run by their public service. They, in fact, ran the public service, that they were the CEO, and the best the public servants were COOs, if that. They had to be in charge. I have to say, though, that not very many ministers have the intellectual self-confidence and the chutzpah to stare down people, particularly people who have been dealing for decades in an area which they might only have come to quite recently. This is why, in the end, what is absolutely necessary if our democracies are to continue to flourish and if our citizens are to feel that democracy makes a difference, is that better people go into our parliaments. Better people offer themselves for public life. If not, we will in fact be run less and less by elected and accountable democratically elected leaders, and more by unelected and unaccountable officials and so-called experts.
First of all, Tony, thank you very much indeed. It was a fascinating lecture, and of course you demonstrated at the very end, when you were discussing about the importance of better people going into politics, that obviously you have to have you have to have politicians who have a grasp of the issues, a strong one, but also a conviction that as elected politicians, they have a moral leadership role to play. Now, it seems to me that this is one of the disputes that affect all our politics. At the moment, for example, I'll just ask you to direct your attention to British politics. To what extent are there people who are able to take on the civil servants, civil servants, some of whom undoubtedly think that their opinions are because they are skilled, because they are knowledgeable, they have an additional authority which the politicians who are temporarily in office do not have.
Well, John, you're absolutely right. There is a tendency on the part of senior public servants to see themselves as the permanent government, while the elected politicians are simply the transient government. And invariably, the permanent government prevails over the transient government far more often than not. And I think this is particularly the case in Britain right now, where you've got what seems to be a very divided Conservative party, a very split Conservative cabinet. And when you've got, as they've had in Britain, and as indeed we've had in Australia, a revolving door prime ministership, that means an enormous churn of ministers, which means that ministers scarcely have time to get their feet under the desk and familiarise themselves with the issues before they're gone. That is a recipe for civil service government, which is a recipe for stasis, for mediocre stasis essentially. And this is one of the many reasons why so many people in so many otherwise and previously vibrant democracies feel so disillusioned. But again, I mean, I was lucky. I was a Conservative student politician in the late 1970s when the campuses were still very much in the late 60s radicalised phase. I was a student at Oxford and had the benefit of the tutorial method where I had to assimilate ideas and create arguments of my own very quickly on all sorts of topics. I was an editorial writer for our major national newspaper where every day I had to come up with a good opinion piece that passed muster with my editors that would also have something meaningful to say to our readers and which came to a position on controversial topics. So I was incredibly lucky when I went into the Parliament and ultimately the government. I was used to arguing with people and I wasn't scared of having an argument with people. And I didn't feel intimidated by public servants. But I'm afraid with a lot, that's not the case, particularly given that we've now got this cult of experts, this expertism, this safetyism, where the elected politicians will invariably tell you on controversial topics they're following the official advice. I mean, that's what we get, that's what we got during the pandemic. That's what we so often get on issues like climate. This is what we often get on defence and security issues. We're following the elected, we're following the official advice. Well, if all politicians do is follow the official advice, why have elections? Why not just have a technocrat government where the officials, the unelected, unaccountable officials, decide everything? Well, I think that's an absolute dystopian nightmare, but nevertheless, that's what so many people who should know better are allowing ourselves to drift towards.
Well, let's look at the voters here for a moment, because you're quite correct, obviously, that in most of these cases, the voice referendum in Australia, Brexit, a recent constitutional referendum in Chile, in which a very similar set of proposals was presented by a left-wing president and then rejected by the electorate. In almost all, and the Irish referendums, in almost all these cases, until the vote itself, the general expectation is that the side of the government, the major parties, big business, the major cultural institutions will triumph, and in particular, the side taken by NGOs, many of whom are, so to speak, treated by the government as the true representatives of the people. And indeed, there is now a proposal from various NGOs that that democracy voting should be supplemented by citizens' councils. I'm fascinated. I'd like to know your argument on how this has happened, that we have this kind of situation, and the reasons. And the reason, could you give a reason why you think the voters turn out to be surprisingly perceptive when they are presented with these questions, and they don't go along with the official view, like as you want ministers to do? They reject it.
Well, John, I suppose where a specific issue is put to the voters, most of them will attempt to become at least somewhat informed about it, as opposed to the general run of politics where, at least in reasonably peaceful countries, voters can be largely oblivious to it and only worry about it at election time. And then at election time, they don't get a chance to sort of nominate lots and lots of dishes from the smorgasbord. They just get either chicken or beef, one or the other. They don't get a great choice. I mean, I don't always like the results of democratic elections if my side loses, but the truth is that I think more democracy is better than less democracy, because the old adage about two heads being better than one is magnified immeasurably when we're talking about 10 million or 100 million heads. I know 50 million lemmings can be wrong, but nevertheless 100 million Americans are much less likely to be wrong than any one individual American is, no matter how brilliant that person might be. In fact, brilliance can often be accompanied by arrogance, which is often the enemy of good judgment. Why is the whole system drifting towards this expertocracy? Well, I think one of the reasons is because in many polities, those who are putting themselves forward for election are from a much narrower class than before. For instance, in Australia, the Labor Party used to put into Parliament the senior officials of trade unions. And in those days, the senior officials of trade unions were usually people who had actually worked in the relevant industry. Ben Chifley, for instance, had been an engine driver. John Curtin, for instance, had been a journalist. These were people who had knocked around in the real world. They hadn't gone from university into political staffing, into lobbying, into Parliament. Now, on both sides of politics, there's a tendency for people to live their whole life in a political bubble. I can remember back when I was PM in Australia, sure, I had been a political staffer myself, but I'd also been a journalist, I'd been a concrete plant manager, I'd been a rugby coach. It wasn't, an entirely monochrome existence, whereas Barack Obama had been basically a political organiser, first-term senator, and then he had the biggest job in the world. David Cameron had been in head office, then I think he was an advertising executive briefly, then into Parliament, and the second biggest job in the world. Hollande, again, had been a party official his whole life before becoming the president. Even though all three of those individuals had many great qualities and made lots of good decisions as well as perhaps not so good ones, they were members of a political class in a way that Gladstone and Disraeli, even Winston Churchill, who had an extraordinary and varied life, at least in his first 25 years, they weren't. So we need better people, but we also need just more diverse people going into our public life if we're going to get better results.
Let me follow on from that. Isn't one of the problems candidate selection within the parties, which has changed in recent years in various ways, because the kind of people who now represent, let us say, the Labour Party, a recent book by Matthew Goodwin shows that manual workers and people from working class occupations were something like about more than half of the Labour Party about 30 or 40 years ago. Now they are probably about 3 or 4 people. It really is as dramatic a change as that. And how can we, in a sense, ensure that the candidate selection is better, and what would better mean?
Well, I can remember in the early years of the Howard ministry, I would sometimes look back on the ranks, and you had an itinerant slaughterman, you had a contract cane cutter, you had a fitter and turner, you had a shearer, you had lots of police and teachers, a couple of nurses, and these were all the people that the Liberal Party's pretty chaotic pre-selection system threw up. On the Labor side of the fence in those days, they'd already got into full-scale apparatchikdom, and nearly everyone there had been a union official or a party official, but nearly all of the union officials had gone straight from university into head office jobs as organisers, researchers, etc. And only then had gone out as state secretaries and assistant national secretaries, and along the way they might have done a bit of token work as a shop assistant or a bit of token work as a storeman and packer, but it was really just a sort of a Tomkin village kind of work. What can we do? Well, I think this is where the more democratic the pre-selection, the more you involve the rank and file membership, the more likely you are to get a broad cross-section of the community going into Parliament as members of the party. But that requires a larger party membership. Now, I've just had, as you have, John, a few days in Canada where we were fraternising with members of the Conservative caucus, amongst other people, and I believe the Canadian Conservative Party has something like 500,000 members, which is pretty amazing. 500,000 members in a country with about 40 million people, that's pretty extraordinary. In Australia, the Liberal Party would be lucky to have 50,000 members. And of the 50,000, I reckon scarcely 20,000 would be active. And that's an embarrassment, but almost never, I mean, if you're the Prime Minister, you're a bit too distracted to do this, but almost never, in fact, I can never recall hearing the Liberal Party New South Wales State President saying to the general public, please, 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 if you normally vote Liberal and if you subscribe to the basic Liberal conservative principles of our party, join the party, and I promise you two things. First of all, you will get a chance to debate policy, because that's what most people want to do when they go into a political party. And second, you will get a chance to choose the candidate. That's the last thing that party hierarchs will do, because frankly, most of them don't want to disturb the insiders' clubs that political parties tend to become. In 2017, I led a push. I was a deposed Prime Minister by then, still in the Parliament. I led a push within the New South Wales Liberal Party to have rank and file pre-selections. And eventually, after a lot of opposition from the party hierarchs, they had to concede the principle, although they tried to gerrymander it a bit in the execution. But having accepted that, yes, we had to have rank and file pre-selections, in about 50% of the subsequent pre-selections, they've managed to rig the system to get around them by, for argument's sake, artificially holding up candidate vetting processes till the last minute. So then it had to be a state executive pre-selection and things like that. So these crooked insiders, I mean, I don't say they're criminally crooked, but they're kind of ethically crooked. These ethically crooked insiders are incredibly good at getting in the way of ordinary, common, decent people having the say that they deserve.
I'll ask one more question and then throw the debate open to the floor. And this, you've heard the phrase, the uniparty, which is an attempt to describe the new kind of political system we really have, as opposed to the left or right debate, which we're familiar with, Labour versus Conservative and so on. And of course, the argument there is that on the really important issues, the two parties agree, and that's why they put forward these motions like the indigenous voice referendum, Brexit, and stand united behind them, and then are surprised by the result. So, what's your view of the uniparty, and what do you think the consequences in future elections of this are going to be?
Well, on the one hand, you would like to think, John, that within a parliament, within a nation, the things that unite people would be more important than anything that divides them. I mean, this was a phrase that I think Menzies first used and John Howard frequently took up. The things that unite us should be more important than anything that divides us. You would like there to be a national project. Obviously, there isn't a country like Israel, but you would like other countries, such as our own, to have a national project that everyone, in his or her own way, is committed to and engaged in. But within that, you would certainly like to see a real contest in the parliament between political parties. And the sad thing is that all too often, you're right, there's a consensus view amongst the political class with a few outriders, if you like, and the consensus view inside the political class is often quite different from the polarities out there in the mainstream. So on The Voice, for instance, we now know that 61% of the public thought it was a bloody awful idea, but probably 80% of members of Parliament, if you'd asked them, 100% of Labor members, and probably close to 50% of Liberal members would have said it's a good idea at the start of the thing. And all credit to Peter Dutton, the Liberal leader, for eventually coming out the way he did. But again, the problem is there are too many bland, homogenised, pasteurised, sterilised people who go into the political process.
Okay. Now, I think we have relatively few homogenised, pasteurised people in the audience, but let's. Who would like to ask the first question? This lady here. Oh, Tony. Sorry, can you wait till the microphone arrives? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm from Australia, a member of the Liberal Party, along with my family. Very strong supporters. We think you're wonderful.
Oh, can we hear the mic?
Our recent concern is, if you look at the state opposition leaders, they seem to be lurching to the left, particularly in Victoria, but even in Queensland. He seemed to be really strong and focused, but he made a recent announcement about 75% renewables on the side of Labor. As members, what can we do to convince them to be conservative members instead of lurching to the left?
Well, this is where I think our members have got to be allowed to debate policy and vote on things, and yet normally the last thing that a Liberal Party conference organiser wants is to have a debate. They just want agreement. I can remember as party leader sometimes being given bits of paper, agendas, if you like, for state council meetings and things, and they'd have about a half an hour in a whole day's proceedings allocated for debate. The rest would be just reports. Reports from the President, reports from the Treasurer, reports from the state leader, reports from the federal leader. And the whole thing was basically hail to the chief. Well, fair enough, if the chief's doing a good job, hail the chief. But I used to say, why is this motion on the agenda? This state council supports the position of the Liberal Party leader on X. I mean, what's the point of that? That's ridiculous. I mean, what about having a debate about all this kind of stuff? But I'm afraid the instinct of the people at the top is always, we don't want anything to disturb our plans, and members can be quite unruly and quirky. And look, you know, there are ratbags in political parties, and you don't want to give a forum to the ratbags, but on the other hand, you do actually have to allow people to have their say. And often enough, you learn from the discussion. I mean, I have to say, in the Howard Cabinet, which I was a member of for almost 8 years, I used to hate having to take submissions to Cabinet because invariably the professional critics around the Cabinet table would seize upon something. I mean, they'd normally not read the Cabinet paper, but they'd listen to what I said and they'd seize upon something and they would create a discussion about it, with an undercurrent of criticism, a critical discussion about it, and then others would chime in. So I can't say I liked it, but on the other hand, I have to say, whether my colleagues knew what they were talking about or not, in the end, I actually think that all of those Cabinet submissions were improved by the Cabinet discussion, even if sometimes it was motivated by impulses other than goodwill.
Tony, you and I have both been political journalists, so I can tell you that following, I was a parliamentary sketchwriter in the 70s. On the occasions at a Conservative Party conference where the leadership somehow lost control and there was a genuine debate on a matter of real importance, the Rhodesia policy in the 60s, I remember, the famous case, building more houses, the rank and file of the party wanted a pledge to 300,000 houses. The leadership didn't want to be tied down. The leadership lost control. There was a debate. On these occasions, not only did the public benefit by a really interesting, passionate, well-informed debate, because most of the rank-and-file people were pretty well-informed, but also the party did. People actually liked it better because they could see a genuine argument being not only allowed, but being successful. And I can't help thinking that the professionals have never grasped the importance of that.
Look, I think you're dead right. I can recall in my latter days as a student and part-time journalist, driving from Sydney to for a skiing weekend down in the snowy mountains. The Labor Party National Conference was on at the Lakeside Hotel in Canberra, and they were debating uranium mining. Yeah. So I thought, that's going to be interesting. Let's stop. Yeah. So I stopped. I really didn't have any particular credentials, but I was allowed in because members of the public in those days were allowed in. There was no great security issue. And Bob Hawke and Bill Hayden and various others were going ding-dong at each other over whether we should be banning uranium, allowing open slather on uranium, or having a limited policy. Gareth Evans, people like that. I mean, I've got to say, the Hawke cabinet was a very talented cabinet. Yeah. The early Howard cabinets were very talented cabinets. The Margaret Thatcher cabinet, whether you agreed with them or not, was a very talented cabinet. Yeah. But it's been a real steady deterioration in our country. Yeah. But that particular debate that I just really came into by accident amongst the luminaries, the then luminaries of the Labor Party, I mean, I wasn't on their side, but gee, I appreciated listening to them, and I really respected the fact that they got up there and had a go. And they spoke their mind. Yeah. And it wasn't all about preserving a united front. It was about trying to persuade people of what they were passionate about. Yeah. And we just need more people of courage, conviction and character in our public life on all sides.
Anyone who remembers Hugh Gaitskell in 1961 actually facing his party, which wanted to pass a motion that would have really undermined NATO, and giving this passionate speech which ended something on the lines of, "We will fight, fight, fight again to save the party we love." You couldn't not respond powerfully to that, even though I was a strong Conservative. Gentleman here, I think. Yes, didn't you raise your...
I have Rhodesian form. I have to...
okay.
Or Rhodes House form. We last met in Brisbane at a Samuel Griffith thing, just after I told Peter Dutton that trying to recreate the Home Office in Australia was not necessarily a brilliant move. What has disappointed me, back to the voice, was the Uluru Ayers Rock declaration. Say somebody like Julian Leeser, who seemed perfectly sound once upon a time and has gone native, if that's the the way one can term it. But I also defy even you, if you were faced with John Stone as a public servant, to face down him. But
well, I never faced John Stone as a public servant, but I have faced John Stone in argument at different times, and yes, he is absolutely formidable. But again, this is where people just have to be prepared to stand their ground and say their piece. I do recall, as a parliamentary secretary, i.e. the most junior person in the government, in 1996, going along to incoming ministers' briefings with Amanda Vanstone, the cabinet minister, David Kemp, the outer ministry minister, and me, the parliamentary secretary, the sort of the junior woodchuck. And for 3 days, we were just hosed down by this team of public servants. It was almost like they were speaking French and we were speaking German. There was just never the twain should meet. And this is where I resolved way back then that I was never, ever going to be flim-flammed by the public service, because it's just the enemy of good government. As for Julian, look, I know Julian Leeser very well. I think he's a good guy. I think he was profoundly misguided on The Voice, and I think he allowed himself to be caught up in a process that he had begun several years earlier with Noel Pearson, a very powerful and domineering individual who on many issues is both courageous and sensible, but on this issue I think he became rather dictatorial and absolutely divisive. I think Julian felt that he in the end he had a sort of a loyalty to a process which Noel had dragged off into what even Julian, I think, thought was a bit of a dead end, but which nevertheless he felt honour bound to support. I mean, there was a little group of intellectual, more or less conservative people who'd been talking to Noel and others for years about a way of recognising Aboriginal people without damaging the Constitution. And originally they'd come up with this idea of a sort of an extra constitutional declaration of recognition, and then they got sidetracked into this indigenous voice. And then, of course, Noel started piling all the various things onto this indigenous voice, and they were like stuck on a train that had left the station heading in the wrong direction, but they didn't think they could get off.
Thank you. Oh, I see.
Is it on? Thank you for describing the...
Can we hear you?
Not on.
Hold it close to the mouth.
Can you hear me now? Great. Thank you for describing the effect of the failure of the referendum, how the politicians and the civil servants are actually going to go and just ignore it. In other words, carry on as if the referendum had been passed. I can recognise that from referendum in Ireland and in various countries that had to carry EU treaties. So that's a known action, they just ignore it. Then you say the solution is to get better people in the parliaments to overcome that. Then you say that the selection process is blocked, that it's bent, so you can't get better people in the parliaments. So what you're doing is you're describing a problem and you're describing the block, but you're not giving me a solution. Other than standing in the street outside of government buildings throwing bricks through windows, what do you do now?
Well, we do need to get better people into the parliament. Often the party system will conspire to keep good people out, but sometimes, despite everything, good people get there. And if 10 good people try, maybe 2 or 3 of them will sneak past the gatekeepers who are trying to keep them out. I mean, look, most institutions promote mediocrity. I mean, very few institutions want a genuine leader to emerge, as opposed to a kind of a safe corporate individual, a safe pair of hands. But we just have to keep going forward as quirky, hopefully brave, hopefully interesting individuals, and hope that the homogenisation, sterilisation process doesn't destroy us before we've got to a position where we might actually be able to make a difference. Yeah. It's a bit like, I guess, a filter system. The filter will keep many good people out, but if enough people have a go, some of them at least will get through, and then we'll have a better system.
One way of getting new people into Parliament is for new parties to emerge and break into the system, because they're all of the members, they're probably newcomers to politics. But of course, the two-party system is very good at preventing the emergence of new parties. You in Australia have got a somewhat different system, and of course much of the world, much of Europe has a proportional representation. Since you've witnessed all of these systems, what do you think is the one you would choose?
Well, they've all got their strengths and they've all got their weaknesses. I mean, a Trump could not emerge in a parliamentary system, certainly not in the Australian parliamentary system, and you might think that's a good thing, but then you might think, well, actually, America needed a disruptor. In the Australian system, proportional sort of preferential voting in the lower house and proportional voting in the upper house means that minor parties can sometimes get representation, but it makes it very difficult for minor parties to actually dominate. Whereas in Britain, first past the post means that parties that get 30 or 40% of the vote can actually dominate the parliament. But then it might be that if an insurgent party could actually get past a certain threshold, it could completely transform the scene. Now, would that be a good thing or would that be a bad thing? I suppose it depends on the insurgent, doesn't it? So look, when I got the heave-ho from the Prime Ministership, I found I must have had thousands of letters and emails from people, many of whom said, start your own political party because the Liberal Party's not working. And I invariably responded to them that it's much easier to fix an existing political party than it is to start a new one. And one of the reasons why these factional warlords devote so much activity to manipulating branches and state councils and things of my own party is because they know it's a good brand. And if they can capture the brand, well, they don't have to do much more because 40% of the public more or less are going to vote for them anyway. I mean, sadly, if you've got the Liberal brand on you, you may well win a seat, even if you're a complete klutz. So look, I reckon that if you're unhappy with the existing system, the best way forward is to join the mainstream party that best reflects your views or which least offends you, and try to make that as good as it can be. I think that is the best way forward. If you really find all of them contemptible and absolutely beyond sufferance, well, okay, maybe think of starting a new party, but it's very hard. Political startups are much more difficult than business startups because politics is a zero-sum game, whereas markets are not zero-sum. But the point I keep making, and again, if I could go back to the earlier question, it's depressing because no politician, even the best, is perfect. No political party, even one that you've worked in and worked for all your life, will ever be entirely satisfactory. You often despair, and yet the point I keep making is effort does not guarantee success, but lack of effort guarantees failure. And if we want things to be better, we've actually got to make an effort ourselves, rather than just sort of charging off into the night because it's all hopeless.
Referendums are disliked in the main by political leaders. It takes away the control of the issue from them. And in the case of the European Union, they've gone to considerable efforts to make sure that if a referendum does produce the wrong result, that it's done again until it produces the right one. But what are the circumstances in which referenda are, so to speak, necessary? And after all, what you started talking about, and we've moved on to other issues, but was a referendum, and it had important effects. So in what circumstances would you tell, let's say, EU politicians, you have to have a referendum in this case because somehow or other the political system needs it?
Well, John, I would say that anything that involves changing the governmental structures must have a referendum, and anything that involves a very serious change of policy should have a vote, probably an election where you seek a specific mandate, because otherwise you're not respecting the public. And in the end, the one thing that ought to be the case in a democracy is basic respect by the elected politicians for the people who elect them.
Can I have another question from the floor? No, not you. Okay, sorry. Anyone here? Nick. Yeah,
thanks. You talked about expertocracies and technocracy. There is surely a deeper problem now, which is called, I think, technically euristocracy. And the problem here is that, particularly in international law, the lawyers concerned, or the judges concerned, like the European Court of Human Rights, calling the issue or the rules or the law concerning this issue a living instrument. Probably people have seen that and wondered what it actually is. What it actually is judges making law on the hoof. And this, to my mind, is an even greater danger than technocracy. And in the case, I'm not particularly a fan of Boris Johnson, in the case where he was constitutionally correct in his ability to prorogue Parliament, the lower court said this is his constitutional right and there's no issue here. When it went to the Supreme Court, which incidentally was invented by Tony Blair to actually bumsuck the European Union, the Supreme Court then invented a law and said that this is unlawful. But it's far more serious in the cases of international law, and we've seen also in the ridiculous case of the South Africans trying to get into the International Criminal Court to condemn Israel to capitulation, basically, to Hamas, how dangerous this can actually be?
Well, I agree that overmighty judges getting out of their lane is a huge problem, and we've certainly seen in Australia judges straying way beyond the kind of strict interpretation of law into fields that look suspiciously like inventing law to suit their own purposes, and invariably their purposes appear to be kind of statist, leftist kind of purposes. I mean, in the case of Britain, one of the things that, as far as I can work out, is still absolutely sacrosanct is the sovereignty of Parliament. And I suppose that uppity judges could say, well, some parliamentary process wasn't adequately followed, but in the end, it is up to the Parliament to decide what the rules are. And I can't understand why the UK Parliament has not simply departed from this European court, which has made their life so difficult in trying to deal with the wave of illegal boats coming across the channel. I mean, what possesses these people to continue to be under the thumb of these unelected, unaccountable, alien judges in Europe, constantly interfering with what the British government was elected to do? I mean, surely they should just not just Brexiteer, but secede from that court. I don't know why they don't, John. You probably know better than I do.
No, I don't. But I do know what Judge Robert Bork, one of the most distinguished legal intellectuals in America, known as the greatest Supreme Court who never was, because the Congress turned his appointment down. He said that the problem with the legal influence in politics today is that judges tend to represent overwhelmingly the views and opinions of a certain social class. And they are not the same as those of the majority of Americans, the majority of voters. That seems to be a common theme running throughout this evening's discussion. And I think it's this will be the last question, I think. I think that we're going to have an election in a few months. And in that election, there are parties which are in effect insurgent parties, which are picking up generally conservative, but not always conservative opinions in the electorate, and representing them against both left and right parties which have forgotten who their original supporters and constituencies were, and those voters are now moving to support these insurgent parties, and in a way, it's in an election that's the equivalent to the indigenous voice referendum, in which neglected voices suddenly rally. Whether or not it will be enough to change things dramatically is another matter. But
well, you're right. I mean, this Reform Party is pretty obviously a vehicle for people who are disaffected former Conservatives, just as earlier the Brexit Party contained a broad spectrum of people who didn't like the EU, but many of them were former strong Conservatives. My assessment from afar, my impressionistic assessment from afar, is that Nigel Farage had a good influence on the 2019 election because the success of his party in the local government elections alerted the Conservatives to their danger, and then Farage had the magnanimity to sit down with Boris Johnson and effectively do a deal whereby the Brexit Party wouldn't run in seats where Conservatives would probably otherwise win, to, if you like, maximise the right of centre result. Now, I think that reflected credit on Farage and on Johnson. My fear with this Reform Party, and I don't know the individual leading it, is that instead of bringing the Conservative Party to its senses, it's going to create an even greater wipeout and usher in what I fear will be the worst Labor government, indeed the worst government in British history. And this is where you've got a real challenge. Do you do things that will punish a government which is bad but not diabolical if the result is going to be a government which is diabolical? Now, I mean, these are matters for prudent judgment. Being an incorrigible Anglophile, I want Britain to have the best possible government. I hope that the best possible government is vastly better than the one it's currently got.
As a matter of fact, though, I was thinking not only of the British election, but of the June European elections. And of course, people in this country are obviously going to be concerned about that. It seems to me that one of the interesting things that's happening in all our politics is new parties, as we say, was pushing forward on left as well as right. There is now a left populist party in Germany. There is a left populist party in Denmark. And these are bound to happen, it seems to me, if the Labour parties become the parties of middle-class technocrats, which tends to be happening. I suppose, really, we have to wrap up now, but if I could just ask you for one final point about, to discuss the way in which you think Europe's politics have got to reflect more the voters and less the technocracy.
Well, John, look, I used to pay attention to what happened inside the EU because I was concerned for the fate of Mother England. But now that Britain is gloriously outside the EU, I tend not to pay a lot of attention to it. I would generally want to see the sorts of robust, common sense conservatism which has tended to predominate in Eastern Europe, more prevalent inside the EU as a whole. And I can remember coming to a conference in Prague, I think it was, not long after the Brexit vote, where all these really good European conservatives were distraught because they thought that at least Britain was their one serious ally inside the EU, and they were now going to be at the mercy of the unspeakable French and Germans. So I suppose there are downsides to every upside, aren't there? But look, I hope, John, that parties which reflect patriotic instincts, common sense economics, and decent, pragmatic social conservatism do well in the European election. I don't know who they are, but I hope they do well.
Well, I think we've had the reflections of a statesman tonight on a range of issues, and I want to thank him very much, as I'm sure you will do as well.